we have an Etherpad. I'm going to restrict sharing to just the smaller set of the screen. Okay. And, oh good, all right.
Hi, Lou Tucker here.
Hey, Lou.
Hello.
I'll put you first in the attendees list since I was just about to type it.
I was here an hour ago, an hour early by mistake.
Oh, sorry.
I don't know what it is with times. I just read them wrong sometimes.
Completely understand. It's always been a hassle for me too. All right. Who else do we have? I have Lou, Rob, Sean. I heard Tim, but no. And I'm hearing a lot of beeps. Not a lot of people identifying.
Hi, this is Mark Radcliffe.
Hey, Mark.
Yeah.
And I'm going to move our agenda back into our spot. Oh, that's right. And then we'll get started. So what my plan is for this is that we'll clean up this page as we go, but just to keep it simple, let's keep the notes at the top instead of having to scroll back and forth along and everywhere, and then we'll build the agenda for meeting 3 as we find items that need to get built. Okay, so if you are not on the list of attendees that we've identified on the Etherpad, we are definitely going to be using the Etherpad heavily for this call, as we usually do. Please add your attendee name to the list. The Etherpad is in the chat session, and it's also DefCore test criteria if you need it. I do not have the IRC open. Let me see if I can connect to that. I don't have enough extra windows to both run the meeting and manage the IRC. Okay. So the agenda, and guys, if things get hard because of the holidays and things like that, then we'll stop. We're definitely not running past 2 hours. I guarantee that. But if we can, we'll go as long as it's meaningful. For the agenda, we have a discussion on the weighting approach that we sort of gotten to the conclusion that we needed in the last meeting. Reopen the review discussion of the existing criteria, adding additional criteria, start talking about the ugly contentious items that we'd identified. And then I'd added, and I'll just throw it into topic 3, which is a okay. So there's some RESTAC use cases. Well, this is really a topic for the broader committee, but we need to figure out ways to accelerate RESTAC work. So we'll hold that topic to another time. Anybody have anything else to add before we dive in on these topics? Looks like John's here. John, is that you? I see you in the Etherpad. Okay. You'll correct it if it's not.
I pinged him on IRC, so that probably will come up.
Got it. Okay. All right, so let's dive in. So do we need any background on the weighting approach, concepts on weighting approach for this?
I believe all of us were at the last meeting, except I'm not sure John was. Dickinson.
Okay, so do we have a consensus? Do we have a consensus view that the rule should be weighted, not absolute?
I agree with that, but I think there should be some that are absolute. I think there should be a very small, extremely small number that are absolute, and the rest of them weighted.
Okay.
Both. Typical answer for me.
No, I think that's reasonable.
Which means they're all weighted. Some have the maximum weight.
Yeah, that's a very good point. You're right, though.
Okay. So let's do it that way.
Yeah.
Okay. So do anybody have suggestions on what to use as a weighting scale for this? And that to make this work? I mean,
meaning like what is there?
So the criteria.
Go ahead.
You go ahead. Well, I think by weight we really mean it's like a must-have. We know that extremes, optional. That you get some minor points for having that, but it's optional. So we really have a must-have or a mandatory. I wonder whether they're just two weights. It might make it easier.
Well, I guess what I'm thinking is that the weighting means that we're going to boil a test down into having one score, right? So.
Right.
So each test will be, and this is where, okay, test not criteria. So we're going to say each test is given a single score. So this will, okay. Okay. So that means that the tests will be ranked, right? And then we're going to say there's a cutoff.
Yeah, so, I mean, we need to pick something for the sake of starting someplace. You'd pick something like 75 as a cutoff.
What I would suggest is that the process of determining the limit is actually something that we determine after the fact, that the cutoff score is determined at the end of the process.
Okay, yeah, sure. It's reasonable. Rather than artificially trying to drive towards some goal.
Right. That, and I actually think that's going to be where it's going to get really interesting, because there's going to be a small set of tests that are in the gray zone, and where we put that limit is going to determine. But then again, we're going to, especially in this pass, we're going to have to tweak the weightings too, right? So.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what we're trying to do is, over all of the services, or let's say for a given service, okay, for Nova, right, there will be, let's say, 20 tests, just for argument's sake, right? And that a test will be marked as, even the simplest case, mandatory or optional. You have to pass a certain, the score that you get for Nova, or for the compute service, then would be how many of the mandatory tests you passed, if we were to do it simply that way, right?
I'm not
What
sure.
percentage? I mean, are we trying to make it like a scoring system like we would for grades for a course, or is that the model?
No, that's not what I was thinking. That each individual test that we consider would get a weight. So let's say there's a test, the Nova API create server call. There's a specific test that does that. That test we would apply these criteria to, and it would. I'm assuming every criteria is going to be, so there's an assumption that each criteria is a pass-fail.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, but so you want, I think what Nova has, create instance, delete instance, has these 30 tests.
Yes.
For the compute service, and they are, let's say, pass-fail. So you pass Nova. The overall service, how well you support Nova, is out of the 30 tests, if you pass all 30, you get a score of 100%. If you only pass 50, you get a score of 50%.
I think you're crossing the core definition with the criteria, this Nova as a whole is you have to pass the core tests for Nova to be OpenStack. But what we're trying to figure out right now is which ones of those tests are the core tests.
Yeah.
And then so each so down on the criteria.
So you're waiting here. You're waiting here is like the voting system for what makes up the core test.
So whether or not a test is a core test, it needs to be.
I see. Okay, so there's these are actually then how we would vote for a test being a core test.
Right, and so
then you.
Yeah. Okay. The reason it's confusing is because the criteria are tests for the tests, right? So when I say criteria, I mean the way we evaluate if a test is considered must pass or not. The tests are the actual thing that checks OpenStack. I know it's really confusing, but I'm trying to be careful in my language to always use the word criteria as the way we select whether or not a test is must pass. Which makes it confusing. But, so from that perspective, we would say, all right, is this Nova test that we're talking about service discoverable?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And create instance. Is it? So there's a criteria number 3 in here that says, is it service discoverable?
Yeah.
And then so if it is, then
so these are the weights on the criteria. I'm sorry, I was confused.
Right. Then we'd weight
these
the criteria.
Okay. Across all the tests, no matter what they are. This is how important we think these criteria are.
Right. What I'm wondering is if we should make the weighting be a total of 100. Like there's a max weight that you can get, and then we would. So if you pass every criteria, you would get 100. I'm wondering if we should do that as a way to make this simpler, right? The max.
Sure. If it's extremely
what we don't want is that if there's a core criteria, if there's really the most important criteria, you've got to meet that. You can't sum up the weaker criteria and have a good test, right? I'm trying to. I want to make an example.
So, what I'm wondering is if this is tricky. What we're saying is that there's no automatic pass, but there might be an automatic fail.
So, for instance, if the code that we determine is must have, be part of every implementation does not exist, that would be an automatic fail, right? As an example.
Right.
But if there's an extension to an API that we're interested in, and we've added a certain level of importance, weighting importance to it, let's say 60%. So let's say 1 to 100, it's a 60, and it fails. That doesn't mean that they automatically fail, but that you just failed to get a 60% weighting on one of the tests. And so they're less likely to pass.
So
yeah.
What I'm wondering is if it makes total sense, but if there are things that are actually disqualify you, I'm wondering if we shouldn't even consider those criteria. Those are really disqualifications.
Or, sure, okay.
Right. Yeah, like the storage has to be open and available. Right.
If they have to pass in this way of weighting them, then they would be outside of the weighting system. They would be pass or fail.
Right. So I think that
all
back to this. Right.
But think of it this way too, guys. We want to be able to do an analysis on the data as it's coming in as people and organizations start using the system and start running through the tests. We're going to create a whole bunch of data that we're going to want to mine, not only just for interest sake, but also to improve the testing system and to find possible bugs in the testing before we start getting, 500,000 complaints. So, and thinking about how we're going to map this out on some kind of Cartesian system is going to be really important for us to start finding bugs.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the thing I'm the most concerned about. I'm a little less concerned about the tests we come up with. I'm concerned about how it gets implemented and how it works or doesn't work, or perceived works or doesn't work. Because we'll come up with really exotic tests for people to pass or fail, but the process for fixing it when it's broken is going to be very difficult to change once we get this thing rolling.
Yep.
So, do we really need to go through all this, or we just, because this sounds like then we have to decide what are the scoring going to be for each one of these criteria before we can actually, should we just, at some point we have to get from the criteria to the hard part, which is saying, is this thing in, the course, and we're gonna spend months just getting to that process. I think the criteria we have here, if we just want to rank order them right now, we should say, and then go through the next process of try and get sort of a run through of the end-to-end process before we totally refine this down to.
Lou, I totally agree with you. Here's the loop that I'm trying to avoid. I don't want us to now fight about what weight the criteria should get or not. What I wanted to do is spend enough time talking this through so that we know we're going to apply a weighting criteria, so that we can then start the process. Because what was starting to happen in our last conversation is people were starting to try and make these acid tests. And some of them, and we were having a discussion of, well, I don't agree to that criteria if it's a pass-fail thing. I do agree to that criteria if it's part of a weighted factor. If it's a consideration.
Okay, then. But if we were to rank order the test, rank order these criteria, you say that's the relative importance of each of these criteria that the five of us, whoever on this phone, subcommittee, decided. Taking that as a ranking of the importance of these criteria, can we then go to the other questions of how do we hand this back to the technical committee and they go through each one of these capabilities and they vote using this as guidance to see if we get a reasonable outcome, or do we uncover other issues at that point? I'm not sure that getting a numerical score will help if then there's a vote by we gather input from the community as to how widely it's used, and then the technical committee has to make a voting or something to really come up with a list.
So there's actually there's a criteria in here. This is not a technical committee thing. We are collecting input from a wide range of things, and so those weights would be part of this. Lou, what we're going to end up doing is we're going to have a body of tests. We need to clump them into consensus must pass, right? Not consensus, but likely must, wants to consider, and the rest. Yeah. And it became pretty clear that with the criteria we've got, some are more important than others, and we're gonna end up having to do it. What I expect is this: we're going to get all that stuff on a spreadsheet or the comparable equivalent, and then we're going to tweak the weighting to see which of these criteria are actually the most important and use some judgment. And then the argument, what I'm really hoping the argument gets to be is how much weight each criteria needs. And then we're going to experiment with, well, if this is that high, then this test comes in. If this is this high, then this test comes in. And then we can actually start to discuss the relative importance of what some of these criteria are based on the actual impact of which criteria get in or out as a consequence. And one of the reasons why I'm suggesting that there's a max weight of 100 is so that if we want to make something more important, we have to make something else less important, right? We balance. Otherwise, I'm worried we're just going to have criteria inflation. We're just going to keep pushing them up until, and that might be reasonable too. It might be a simpler conversation. But,
it's actually a good way we should probably document that, because that will make each new project that's added to core make the other projects a little less important.
Well, I'm not expecting that to happen. No. You jumped from the criteria to the test.
No, but the logical conclusion of this is if we're going to say each grouping of each project that's involved in the testing has a certain amount of relative value to the other ones, and you need to have a sum of a certain amount to be able to say that you've passed the test. If we add another 10 projects, then the 10 that existed previously are now 50% less important. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure.
I think actually that's important, and that kind of goes along the lines of what we've been talking about, that we want to keep things less complicated. We want to add the least amount of whatever we're doing, the least amount of change possible. And adding a ton of new projects, I think, would be very bad. And each new project, just like each new gold member, we should take very seriously. Not that there's a certain amount of, not inflation, but relative loss of value of the previous projects or whatever projects when we add new stuff. So I guess I'm saying I like that idea.
I agree with it, but I want to make sure I don't want to by weighting limit the number of tests that we would consider. I think that the way the criteria is defined, it should in itself create that effect, right?
No, I'm not saying we should limit the number of tests. I'm just saying the relative value of each one of them as the total number goes up should decrease. Because otherwise, what you said before, inflation will occur. Everything will be important.
I'm not as. Are you worried about that from a criteria? Because you're talking. The example you're giving is about tests for projects, not criteria. Right. I would agree with you about criteria, that we don't want we don't want to bring in 6 new criteria every cycle that if we brought in 6 new criteria, then we're saying, well, okay, then we have to make some other criteria less important. But for tests, I'm not as worried about that. If we have 10 times the number of tests next cycle, which would be awesome, then it might be perfectly reasonable to have a matching growth in the number of core tests. Just right, a certain percentage of our population of tests will likely be core tests. I wouldn't weight it. I would rather see us do that type of. If we're going to look at that, I'd rather look at it as a ratio that way. But once again, somebody could then skew that just by dumping a whole bunch of tests. I don't want to see that either.
So, Rob, is your expectation on this call today that we can get the weights assigned to these criteria?
No.
So we can. Okay, then when would we do that, and how would we do that?
I would expect that we would do that either in the next meeting or after we've gotten some data to actually apply the criteria to. I think the weighting is going to be based on. I think we're going to be playing with it. I think we're just going to set them all to 1 over n, the number of criteria, and then individually go play with our spreadsheet and then come back with some suggested weights. That's what I'm expecting, is that we'll have a meeting where we set the weights. All I wanted to do for this meeting was say, yes, we are going to weight these criteria and have some rough guidance on it so we can go back to discussing the criteria with the expectation that they're going to be weighted. Okay,
so we would go through a cycle of testing this, of looking at this process through the view of when we have actual tests to see whether so if we end up with these 50 tests, let's say, we say that's defining the capabilities we really think are important, and that now we can assign the weights for the criteria such that result would come out.
Right. That's exactly right.
Wow. Okay.
So I would say that we could do some of this today. I mean,
I would suggest let's make a straw man, like instead of 1 over n, we can at least,
as long as I think we need to make sure we've completed the criteria. That's actually the higher priority to me.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Right, and then the only trick is that we were starting to trip over if we are going to weight things, then I would phrase it this way, and if we're not, then I would phrase it that way. And so since that was becoming a repetitive conversation in the last meeting, I felt like we could just run that to ground right now and say, okay, we will weight them. We'll weight them once we have a better idea. I felt like we could close.
These can be weighted, and right now they're all equal. But they will be a variable. So there will be a weight associated with each one. I think that's fine. And then we can see whether they need to be different from each other or not.
So these criteria, can we say that we're going to break them up by the projects that are considered to be core? And
no, I wouldn't.
We wouldn't? All core projects have to have some tests, right? That are pass-fail and weighted? Wouldn't that be the case? Otherwise, why are they core?
I think we're trying to get away from saying core project altogether.
Okay, so important.
You would say
what was the word we picked?
Core is going to be a test based on it's going to be a statement of capabilities. So you'd say that Nova has these core capabilities, but Nova's not a core project or not. It's that these capabilities are considered core.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So this is more. Excuse me. As long as we agree we're going to change the bylaws, it's fine to get rid of core. But as long as we keep the bylaws, we'll have to keep core. So those two issues are somewhat linked.
Right. And that was where the suggestion from. And this completely threw Sean. You were on the Legal Affairs Committee, and Mark, I know you were. threw us into a loop on the legal affairs side of this, which was considering the program's core and defining there's core programs, and the projects are really members of a program. So Nova Compute. This is my reasoning. This is not my suggestion yet, although I need to write it up. The Nova Compute is a core program, and there are capabilities inside of the projects that comprise that we consider core capabilities based on the test passage. But saying Nova is core is not as critical as saying the capabilities of it are.
Got it. Okay, so of the programs, each program will have a battery of tests that are pass-fail, and they'll have a battery of tests that are optional, weighted, and can contribute to the overall passability of whatever's being tested. Right? That's part. Well, I'm trying to kind of think through.
You switch to tests. The tests aren't weighted.
Tests aren't weighted. The criteria are weighted.
The criteria are weighted. So what would happen is that of all of the body of tests, it'll be easier once we actually have a spreadsheet which we're supposed to get of all the tests. So I'm envisioning a spreadsheet that has each test in it, and the tests are basically going to be capability grouped. So there might be 10 tests that test Nova create instance. And each test is going to have a score pass-fail for each one of the criteria that we identify. So there'll be another 10 columns or 12 columns on that spreadsheet for each test, and it'll say yes or no for every test criteria. And then each column will have a weight, and then we're going to sum those weights and come up with a number. So that test will say, so if it passes 6 of the let's say there's 10 criteria, if that test meets, not passes, if that test meets 6 of the 10 criteria, then we're going to take the weights for those criteria, assuming 10 each right now, that would get a score of 60, and that one test would be a 60 in the relative ranking of a score of 60 for that one test. Got it. And then so in that process, we'd be able to score every test based on whether it meets the criteria or not. And then the weighting gives us that means that in each individual, because here's what was happening in the last meeting, right? We'd say, oh, we have a criteria, and people are like, well, I think that should be in there, but it's not as important as something else. And we were getting very caught up in the binary nature of the criteria. Right. So, you might have a criteria that is not very stable. It hasn't been stable for a whole bunch of releases, so it doesn't score there, but it meets a whole bunch of other criteria, and people think that should be core, even though the test isn't stable. And so that gives us the flexibility to look at how all this stuff works.
Okay.
And it could be that some of our criteria at the end aren't very meaningful based on their impact, and we might downweight them or eliminate them. Got it. Right, and this is what I don't want us to do is get too caught up in whether or not a criteria is the right criteria or not. There's a part of me that wants to create criteria, test them against the actual tests, so to speak, and then see if they're useful.
So this is Mark Radcliffe. I mean, one of the things I also think we need to think about is the procedure for changing our criteria. Because one of the potential consequences of changing criteria is people will fall out of compliance.
Okay. I'm going to add that to the agenda for the next meeting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I think there has to be a notice period and some period for people, I think there should be some period for people to, respin their product if the change in the criteria suddenly takes them out of compliance, right?
Well, that would only assuming that it impacts the tests are really what's going to make a product go in or out of compliance.
Right.
So the criteria are targeted to shouldn't create a lot of churn in the test. That would be a problem. So I think what you've done is you've identified a new criteria in this, which is effectively saying that a test that is a must-pass test should stay a must-pass test.
Well, I think the bigger danger is if it's a must-pass test, it can always be dropped down to, some type of weighted average. What would be, I think, challenging is if somebody has passed all the criteria, now we add another must-pass test which they don't meet, and what happens then?
That's going to happen, and that's part of the challenge of version by version compliance. It's not going to happen retroactively.
As long as it's version by version or some other way of dealing with it, that's fine. I'm neutral on that. I just want to make sure that we don't have surprises for people or create a situation where, either the marketplace, either the user base or the supplier base gets surprised by this in bad ways, shall we say.
And that's one of the things that I like about doing the weighted criteria is that we should see very clearly this test is near matching the cutoff, and if it had these changes, then it would become acceptable, right? This should be very quantitative, right? You can say, all right, this test is below the required threshold because of the criteria, it doesn't meet this criteria, and if it did, it would get above the threshold. And so we should be able to see release by release very clearly which tests are candidates for must-pass status. Right. Part of my goal for this is we're trying to take the debate out of a lot of this, so that it's not a subjective I think this is a required API and I don't, but it matches with these criteria. This is why the weighting is going to be really interesting.
So up to this point, to Mark's point, we've been very loose with being able to use the mark. And what we're doing here is we're making it very qualitative and therefore very quantitative as far as how we want to apply or not apply changes to the weighting and the criteria themselves. So I think it may have not been our intention, but I think it makes a lot of sense for us as we go forward to tie in changing the criteria and the weighting in with new releases. And we actually create a new group that, or maybe just the Rally group or whoever's doing some derivative of the Tempest group to actually work on this throughout the year. It's going to be, it wouldn't take much for somebody to take this the wrong way if there was a mistake made or an intentional change made and it dropped some people out or included some people in that others didn't agree with. So it's going to become very political, even though that's not our intention, that using trademarks becomes very political.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And that's why I'm trying to make it more quantitative.
Whatever we do, I think we need to have a transition period, and maybe we implement it, when the next version comes out. But what we don't want to do is pull the rug out from underneath anybody. And I think we have to be very clear about what these are, and what when they're going to become effective.
Right. And Mark, we've been doing that in discussion. We need to communicate to the community, but the timelines for this I I believe we've been very specific, right? The Havana, at the Juneau Summit, we're going to have the Havana criteria. It'll basically be preliminary. And then at the, that'll allow us to then collect feedback around Ice House, and plus, basically start this process again on the Ice House, which will actually be materially important because the Ice House criteria are really the ones that are going to be the official ones. So there'll be a whole cycle. And then the expectation is for the Juneau release, we would be able to then have the Juneau criteria, the Juneau tests set at the Paris summit.
I don't know. It sounds to me like there's pretty strong disagreement behind you on this.
In what sense?
Well, I heard a lot of barking in the background, so that suggests that this doesn't pass the test here.
The dogs are baying at the moon. Yes. So, Mark, I think we've got a phase-in plan, and I don't think we're going to pull the rug out of anybody for this.
No, it sounds. I mean, that sounds fine as long as it's communicated effectively. That's all.
That's always our challenge. Yes. I'm planning to start. I'm coordinating with Lauren about this. So Jonathan and I'll have some posts and videos and materials about how this goes, and we're just going to have to take the tests and show people what the criteria are, and that's when people are going to pay attention. Right. These individual criteria aren't that interesting until you have a test that isn't considered must pass because it doesn't reflect a future technical decision direction. Right. That's exactly that's when these things will get discussed. Right now they're too abstract. We unfortunately have to do this work and it's abstract. In the next 2 months, it's going to get very concrete because we're going to apply them to a list of tests and we're going to have to say yes, no. All right, so with that, I'd like to transition from talking about the weighting to going back on the test. I think we've already found another criteria for this. So that's this. So this is our agenda, right? We're a little behind on weighting approach.
Rob, you still there? Sounds like we
Rob,
lost
you
Rob.
there? Rob looks like he dropped off. You want to complete Rob's sentence?
Very sorry, my phone died. I just switched.
Okay.
Okay. So just from an agenda perspective, our waiting approach was 15 minutes. We're way over that, but that's fine. I was hoping we would now go over the criteria that we've got. I would actually suggest that we're going to hold the contentious items until we have a bigger quorum, and spend the next time looking at additional criteria and where we go. Okay. I definitely have at least one more to add, but and as a review, what we have is we have criteria that are consensus. Everybody thinks they're right. Ones that we said weren't right, and then we have ones that we know we're going to need a bigger discussion on. So the first one we have is the test is stable for at least two. The test is required stable for at least 2 releases. I think this is should actually say the code that is tested, but I'm not sure that that's. I think we discussed this last time, that it's actually the test that we're talking about.
Yeah, I believe this is just mirroring what the intention for the trademark is. or has been communicated up to this point, that the trademark would be valid for up to 2 releases.
Should we just simplify this, because we're interchanging capability with test with code? If we just say capabilities, the capabilities should be stable across multiple parentheses greater than 2 releases. The capability is discoverable. The capability is widely used in many cloud computing platforms.
So I don't think we are using the different words, and they have very specific meanings. So let me define what the meanings are. Because I think we're using them correctly, and then we're second guessing ourselves. So a test is the actual code is misused. The actual functional test that creates a pass-fail result against running code. Okay. Code, the actual implementation of OpenStack. Okay. Capability is a cluster of tests that express a user-facing.
What?
I'm not even sure.
Yeah, isn't the I think we all know what a capability is essentially what a service provides. So that's why I'm saying. So, and that's why we have in here, capability being tested is service discoverable, is one of our criteria 3.
But I would say that, but I don't think that it's necessarily a broad set of capabilities. I think when we've talked about capabilities so far, we've broken it down to potentially a single API.
It could be. I mean, I don't think it can be broad or it could be wide, but okay. At the end of the day, you have a test for a capability, and you have to pass the test.
And the idea was that there might be a cluster. We expect that there'll be a cluster of tests.
Sure. Yes, that's right.
And there'd be a cluster of tests that can test.
Because I'm just trying to make it so that. Because if we make these criteria we have to have other people who haven't been on these long calls, to understand what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. So my canonical example is the 4th one in our criteria about candidates are widely used capabilities, right? I'm trying to get the wordsmiths, like capability is included, or is expected to be included in widely used cloud computing platforms, tool sets, and relied upon by application developers. It's a common thing in a cloud. Mm-hmm. Create instance. If we don't have a create instance, I don't know that we have a cloud.
Right.
So capabilities seem to be a good way to say that. And that then we have tests are the things that you can actually run to test that capability.
So they can be defined in user. They can really be defined in user terms as part of what we're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and in English. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So we have test, code, capability, criteria.
Mm-hmm.
This is it's a weighted score applied to a test to determine if it's is the candidate. Okay.
So if, in this example, if a test is has all the criteria that would express the full capabilities that we want to test for a given project, then it would be mass pass.
If it had all of the criteria, if it passed all the criteria, it should get a weighted score of 100. Right?
It must pass.
Yes. If a test meets all criteria, then it is scored as 100 and considered must pass. So anything that meets all criteria is a must pass test.
Okay. All right.
I think that's right. But there's multiple criteria, and I don't think we have to make criteria binary. To tell you the truth, I think we could actually, as long as we're clear on it, we could define. Okay.
I'm just wondering, thinking this through the implementation. If I have 6 tests, let's say, 5 of them that have partial capabilities, or excuse me, the partial criteria, and one that has all of them. If I pass the 5 that have all partial criteria that equal up to the sum total, let's say there's 10 criteria, and the sum of all of them means that I passed all 10, but I can't pass the one that has all 10 in one test? Would that be the situation that we'd want to find ourselves in?
No, I would think that you would, if you passed 8 of the 10 criteria,
Yeah.
right, then you're going to get a weight. It's going to be, say, 75.
Okay.
And then we're going to have a separate threshold that says any test that has a score of 75 or above is considered must pass.
Okay.
Um,
All right. Well, let's just go through this.
I'm sorry, I don't understand that. Any score that requires 75% or above is a must pass. What?
This is going to get clearer as we actually put the correct tests, weight the correct tests with the criteria.
So I think one of the key things, and this may be difficult to communicate, but the criteria are for determining whether a test is must pass or not.
Right.
There's no weighting to the test. Like, you don't end up getting a score of either your 75% core or 65%. You either pass the must pass test or you don't. The criteria and weighting process is only to help us determine, out of all the tests that we have available to us, which ones make the must pass qualification. So a test, like Rob said, if you add up all the criteria and the weighting pieces, and you come up and say, well, that has a score of 75, then that's likely to be a must-pass test. But once it's a must-pass test, you either pass it or you don't.
Correct.
You don't get a 50% score for the test that only scored a 50 on the weighting and a 75 for the other ones. You either get pass or fail on the others.
Right.
The criteria is only involved in determining whether it's the must-pass criteria or not. And I think sometimes so the weighting isn't sort of evolving into a score, that if you get above 75 on all the tests that are in the thing, you get core. It doesn't work that way.
Right.
Yeah, I think we're going to find some problems with this, but I'm totally willing to wait on nitpicking until we get some of this stuff rolling, because I think it's going to become a lot more clear.
I think so. I think it's confusing now because we're not. It's very abstracty type of stuff. And I'm trying to get enough of this done so that we can then actually do a test run. It's like building the code. And then once we've done that, it'll be much more obvious what we need to tweak.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. This is good so far. I like this. We're making good progress. So now, Rob. Oh, we lost Rob. Are you guys still there?
Here, I'm here, Lou.
Okay.
Well, I just want to make sure. That
While we're waiting for Rob, I mean, if you actually look down, I just added below the notes, comments. I actually would like to get the criteria really simple, straightforward, easily understood. So here's my straw man. Is anybody able to see that? They're in purple on the Etherpad. Blue simple criteria for discussion.
I can see it, Lou.
Okay. So the first one tries to cover the whole issue, all of the issues around. It's widely used in many cloud platforms, kind of expected to be there, relied upon by application developers. Create instance, store this block, use a key value, those kind of things. The second has to do with the quality. The capability is well documented, it's stable across multiple releases, and it's consistent with the future technical direction. And then the third.
Lovely. All right.
Are you back?
Back and forth. I'm back again. I'm now on my third way to connect to this conference. I'm on a. We'll see if this one works better.
Okay, we were just passing the time. I was actually trying to move us along. I think, like you're saying, we want to sort of test whether this stuff actually makes any sense a little bit.
Right.
So I tried to just take a straw man here below, half a page down from where I think the end of your criteria are. Blue simple criteria of like, can we get to 3? Maybe it's 4, but I'm trying to group a lot of the things I've read in the other ones so that we can
Lou,
get.
We really need to put them into the criteria we've got. So please look at the 8 now from the previous meeting. Okay.
Yes. So that's why the first one is essentially 4 widely used capabilities. I mean, I tried to condense it. Well, I haven't added anything new in here. Instead, I've condensed.
Yeah, I don't think we need them necessarily any more condensed. The issue is not if we can measure these at this point.
Okay.
I think the trick is, do we have the right ones?
Okay.
And then we'll go back. We have a
That's
commitment
fine.
to
That's fine.
Once we actually have the list, we'll press them and we'll see if there's an issue.
Okay.
So the idea here was not that the code was stable, but that the test was stable. So I think that this is worded correctly.
Okay.
Although there are gaps, and we're going to have I suspect for Icehouse we're going to have a whole bunch of new tests that we want to be core, but could be that that's not that they won't make it because of that rule. The code has an extension framework, so this might be something that we could do more broadly. I was thinking about this. We actually want to make sure that it complies with the principles that we laid out before, and is really where I'm wondering if this is that.
Yeah, I don't know what the second part of that means. There should be parity. I think we discussed this before, and it still was not clear. There should be parity in capability. If we're saying it's desirable that because if we're talking about the test of the capability, or that this capability should be built on an extendable framework, that I would agree with.
Right. That's what we're trying to. This is one of the places where there's a weighting. There might be a test.
So the wording of this, I guess, is confusing a little, or needs to be cleaned up. It's being built on an extendable framework, yeah.
This is really as per the principles.
Yes, and
I could type.
But the actual extensions, that's why the second part is not what we're going to be testing. Right.
Correct. Right.
So that's why this should be parity in capability. I found difficult to. In other words, the whole idea of extensions actually is that they will be different. So there's no parity.
It's about the testing capability.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I don't have the words right in front of me because I can't see it. But I mean, when you look at something like floating IPs or something that is actually an extension, I mean, you would want that extension, even if there's different ways to implement it, to perform the same way if it was a must-pass test, right? Because I mean, we are talking about
I actually think
tests that are not in the core API.
I think not. The whole reason why, at least my understanding of why we have extensions, is because there isn't necessarily agreement that everybody should have this, right? And so we expect there's a normal process that at some point we expect floating IPs to become a part of a core API, and then it has to have the same semantics and everything, no matter what.
Well, I think at least in the
Right.
earlier discussions that we've had, we certainly haven't. Extension could be part of core. Now, I think we talked about giving something that's in a core API a higher weighting than something that's not in the core API.
Yeah.
We certainly haven't precluded something that's not in a core API from being a must-pass test.
I thought an extension was explicitly not core by definition, so therefore we wouldn't consider it.
No,
that's kind of what we're trying to do here.
Right. The extensions, there is a requirement that every extension framework have an OpenStack variant that is considered core, right? The capabilities expressed by extensions could be core capabilities. As a matter of fact, they probably are. Going back to our Nova example, you couldn't have a Nova create instance test without hitting an extension framework, because the virtualization layer is part of the extension framework.
So here we're using extensions in two different ways, though. You're describing extensions as something that works underneath sort of a plugin model. I think Lou's actually API extensions where you're actually extending beyond the base versioned API.
And I would say
we want to make sure we don't confuse those two.
Well, in the core principles model, they're actually intentionally confused. I hate to say it. I hate to say those two words together, but what we did was we said that we called those designated areas instead of extensions, and so what we could do, we could say we could use that word, designated area of extension or something like that.
Okay. But I think what we're saying is, you're right. We have to distinguish. So why don't we, when we talk about API extensions, why don't we always say API extension rather than anything else? So that, and my argument is that we should explicitly not test API extensions as a part of this criteria.
But testing, so
because we actually should say if something is going to be used by everybody, we should move that from an API extension to a regular OpenStack API.
Right. And so this is the balance, right? This is where we're trying to create these balances, right? You could say I want to downweight something that's an API extension. Perfectly cool. It will fail this criteria. Although I'm not sure that's necessary. And then you could say, well, but we want something that's in common use, which is down in number 4, and it will therefore get weight for that. And so it could be that the weight for item 4 is 20 and the weight for item 2 is 5, and therefore 4 is going to trump it, right? And that would let things come in. That's exactly why we want the weighting.
Okay, I guess what I'm trying to avoid is, would we end up then with a test for an API extension as part of our definition of core? In which case, that's kind of funny.
if it's
Could
commonly
we end
used
up in
and
that
most
case?
people require it, we could very easily end up with that
Even
being
though-
a core.
Well, then shouldn't we just change it to make it a core API? I mean, an OpenStack API rather than an extension.
Well,
No,
that's where I think we get into the difference between the PTL. I mean, that's really a PTL's choice about what's in the version of the API. I mean, do we want to tell that through this process, or do we want to say? I mean, I think that maybe this goes into the contention piece, because I think Josh certainly may have a view on this, but whether it has to be in the base API as defined by the project or not. Up to this point, we've said we wouldn't make that an absolute criteria, but we'd leave it up to the weighting to sort of balance that. But
yeah, and I would like to consider that as a good option, because otherwise we're going to jump into the area where we're putting weight on something that the TC does not, and that didn't sound like a good path forward. Or putting extreme weight on something. If we start calling certain extensions, considering them to be part of core and critical, and the TC does not, I'm not sure that's where we want to be. I totally agree with putting heavy weight on things and weighting different extensions, API extensions, or whatever way we want to define it. But does that make any sense?
I think you guys are jumping ahead.
I didn't feel like it. I just okay. Well, let's keep going then.
And let me explain why I make that comment. There's different things that govern these criteria that make sure that the TC isn't overruled or the TC has a view. But part of what we're trying to do with this is to make the ruling, the judgment on some of these balanced, and give users a right to say, hey, this is really important to me. I need this for me to run interoperable clouds. And so part of the criteria are to be able to even out the influence of different groups. And there are specific principles here that do allow the TC to throw flags, but we specifically, very specifically said we will not have one group that can throw a flag, a veto on a criteria or a test. We actually made that's actually in rejected criteria. We don't want the TC to be able to say, I think that this shouldn't be in core over the user's objections. And so it could be that they're out of sync, and we want to allow that to emerge.
All right. Yeah, we'd have to figure out how that works.
Right.
In implementation, but yeah, it sounds like a good premise.
The purpose, to me, the purpose of this number 2 item was to say that we don't want a test we don't want to test. Now we're back to the individual. From this criteria's perspective, a test that does not have an extensible backing or is part of an extensible capability is not as preferred. And this actually limits us to say, hey, look, we want to make sure that if the code that's tested, we want it to be part of have alternate implementations. That's all we're saying.
Okay, even stronger, Rob. You're saying that if there's alternate implementation, let's say we're on multiple hypervisors, right? And the capability we're going to test is launch instance.
Yep.
That should work in the same way, regardless of the hypervisor.
Correct. And that you wouldn't be able to meet this criteria. And you wouldn't meet this criteria if the test required some specific configuration. So.
Yeah. So I think as it's stated there, I like that. I mean that. Okay. And what you're talking though about is where we have plugins for different hypervisors and things like that. Whereas I was interpreting this as API extensions, which I think are actually like excluded in this. But you're talking about alternate implementations, which I think it is important that we want to have alternate implementations. We think that's healthy, and where there is, they have to work the same way.
Right. If you were testing something that required a specific configuration, you would fail. You would fail this criteria.
Yeah. Yeah.
Capability being tested is service discoverable. Looks like Monty didn't tweak this wording, but I think people will understand this.
Yeah.
Candidates are widely used capabilities, and then we subdivided this into 4. Public clouds, into public clouds and products, supported by common tools and part of common libraries. So those might actually end up being individual pieces.
If you're thinking that this criteria is a single criteria that would have a single weight, number 4, regardless of its sub-components?
I think we're going to end up breaking these into smaller pieces, and then we'll go there.
Okay, so each line here would be is a separate criteria, which would have a.
Yeah, I think we're going to end up wanting that, or we're going to end up allowing. And I started allowing this in weights. Is that you might be able to say of the 20 points, that you can get, it's 5, or 18 points, and it's 6, 6, and 6, or something like that. We might actually be able to be.
Okay, so section 4 might have 20, and you can break it up into pieces under that.
That would be part of what I'm thinking. I don't know. We're going to have to figure out how to do that. Number 4.
Okay. Okay.
But I think it's an important criteria, obviously. Test capabilities that are required by other must-pass tests. So this one, I think we ended up. This is a variant of the Shuttleworth test.
I don't see how we go about knowing which are the must-pass tests during this process. It's the classic problem in recursion here. So I almost think that we said that there are things that exist outside this that must, after we go through this ranking, if we discover that things did not pass but are required by must-pass tests, then they get grandfathered in.
Yes, like everybody would start with this as a 0 or something. No, this is exactly right. You're going to end up with somebody saying, "Hey, wait a second. If this heat test is must-pass, heat requires all these things to be working before it can pass, and so this is meant to help catch that." Because you're certainly in a pickle if you have a must-pass test that needs things that aren't also must-pass tests. Right. Should reflect future technical direction. So this addresses our deprecated items. Should be well documented, particularly the expected behavior. I think that ends up being an important and interesting one that I think is also going to be tricky to quantify. But once again, it's possible that we could actually say, has extensive documentation, has minimal documentation, we could have degrees on that. Let's see, and then what we added this time was a test is a must-pass test, should stay a must-pass test. So this to me, and Mark, I really like this idea. I don't think this was exactly what you intended, but it's a good result. We don't want a test that was must-pass in one cycle to be no longer must-pass in the next cycle. And so this gives weight to things that we've already decided are must-pass to stay must-pass tests.
Well, actually, mine was the reverse. I'm less concerned about things falling away from being must-pass than adding new things that are must-pass.
Which would cause others to fail. Yeah.
Yeah, as long as we coordinate, so and as long as people understand that it's a release by release, approval process, I think that makes perfect sense. Yeah, then I'm
okay.
frankly, then I'm a lot less concerned about it, to be blunt about it. So.
Okay. I have a preference for this rule because I think that it's going to make it more predictable for people. So we have to have a reason for taking tests out of the list.
I don't disagree with that. I think stability of the list is going to be important. I mean, yeah, if every new release has, you know, a raft or maybe 2 rafts of new tests, that would be a bad thing.
Right.
I like predictability is a good thing.
And so from that perspective, so a test for capability with must-pass tests is more likely. We talked about this one. So this is the clustering, sort of a clustering thought. Is that if we're already testing Nova create instance, and there's 6 tests that test Nova create instance, that it's probably more likely that you're going to want that cluster of tests than others. That sound that reasonable? I've mixed. I don't know that we need to put this in here because I think that this is actually a entry criteria that complies with the core principles.
Yeah.
And the discussion we had earlier around number 2 makes me feel better about that. So I'm gonna take that out. That was
I would strike it.
And I'm watching the time, so we're coming up on the 90-minute mark. So
I will
like this.
drop them.
Okay. My preference would be to wrap it in 10 minutes. Also,
Okay.
I think that we've added two more criteria, which I think is helpful. We've rejected the legally encumbered and the veto, so those I think are still good. Things we don't want to worry about. And then our non-consensus ones that we're still carrying forward. This ended up being our contention item here, and I think we've made some progress. Tests were not considered without an extension framework. This is the Mark Shuttleworth item that's going to need some more discussion. Candidates. So, and this to me becomes one of the things that could come in as a criteria with weighting. Let me read it for people who are looking at the screen. It says candidates favor capabilities that users cannot implement if given the presence of other capabilities, which means that if I have a capability that I could implement using other must-pass capabilities, then we would score it down. And so a capability like Keystone, where there was no alternate way to implement it, you had to have Keystone, there was no substitute, would be scored higher. That capability would be scored higher than, say, something like Heat, which you could implement on top of an OpenStack cloud without any other without needing a fundamental capability. I think we need to work on wording for that.
I think that's going to be a little tough because Heat would never. Heat obviously anybody could build Heat. Anybody could actually build Swift. Anybody could actually build just about any of these things except for Keystone and Nova.
Yes, and Lou, that's exactly why people like this criteria. Because what it does is it keeps core very small. And so the argument would be unless there's a lot of need, this capability is, if it's widely used, bring it in. But if it is not widely used and could be implemented on top of an existing OpenStack cloud, then that would downweight it. And weighting changes this whole conversation, because all of a sudden we can say, you know what, this line, this idea of a standalone capability versus a addable capability might just be a factoring element where it could be worth 10% or 5%, and then it becomes much more interesting to talk about it like that. Instead of it being yes, no. If it's a yes, no thing, people don't like this criteria. If it's it might be a 5% consideration or a 10% consideration, this criteria becomes really useful because it might be a tiebreaker.
Then I think then the wording of, we just have to figure out the right wording of that. Something like, unique capabilities that cannot be built out of other OpenStack capabilities, are considered important or something.
Let me say that as must-pass capabilities.
Okay. Are you writing this somewhere in the Etherpad? I don't see it.
Oh yeah, sorry, I'm at the bottom. I'm down in the non-consensus criteria, line 109.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Okay. And so the phrase should not be considered as strongly all of a sudden make it a criteria now that we have weighting.
Okay, then the way to positively state that as a criteria that we have up above would be that capability is unique and cannot be built out of other must-pass capabilities.
I like it. I like it a lot. Okay. So I'm gonna actually make this the actual text, and then we'll do it like that.
Okay.
All right. That's very good. And I think that with the weighting change, that this could actually, I don't want to do it in this meeting, but I think that could actually become a must-pass or a consensus criteria at that point. Okay. And then I think we get into the same thing here. Tests do not require administrative rights. Is potentially allowable.
I don't know what that means, because there are some things that we absolutely, that are we saying that we will not be testing for the capabilities that only an administrator can perform?
Right.
Is that the intent?
There are tests right now that require administrative access.
Mm-hmm. But those we are not considering.
This is why it's non-consensus. So one of the changes I've been driving on RefStack is that instead of RefStack being a third-party test, meaning that it's run against a cloud somewhere by an external party, that we're altering RefStack to allow you to run your own version of the tests against your own cloud and upload the result. And if let's use Rackspace as our case in point. If you were Rackspace, or HP if you want, but let's say Rackspace. So if you're Rackspace, Rackspace could run RefStack, run the tests, upload their results, and say, this is the official Rackspace result for the test place. And they have administrative access, and they can do that. They might have 100 customers who run the same battery of tests but can't pass all of the tests because they don't have administrative access. But then they run it against their own cloud, and they do have administrative access, and they pass a broader set of tests. They could still, those tests might be very useful tests, and we want them. We just might not want them as they, might be a harder barrier if you don't have administrative. Makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, we're either choosing to include we're either to include in the definition of OpenStack a certain amount of administrative functionality for administrators or not.
Correct.
And if we simply saying no, at this point at least, let's not worry about the administrative functions. Let's get the application developer, the user capabilities defined.
Right.
We can always bring them in later.
Right. And so the idea here is that that's going to end up being a weighted criteria, and it could be that we're like, you know what? This test looks awesome in every other way except it requires administrative access, but we still want it. And so this would let us, that might then score 90 out of 100 or, right? But that would be an indication that we probably want that test to be included. The reason why this wasn't consensus is because some people started from a position of only the user tests. We have a lot of tests that are administrative rights tests.
Sure.
Okay. So isn't this just saying that there's going to be two classes of tests?
Well, there already, with must pass and not must pass, there are two classes of tests. This is just one of the criteria that we would consider. Is what it's coming back to. Right, we have a preference for tests that don't require administrative rights, but it's not a disqualification. Is the way I would look at that.
All right.
And I think this one's a duplicate. Okay. Okay. So if you guys are all right, we'll do it this way. The first item on that list is considered a duplicate at this point about the extension frameworks, and that with the idea that these are weighting, not absolute, those two other criteria become likely candidates for the list.
Right.
Okay. So with that, my gut feel is that 10 or 11 criteria are probably a good number for starting.
Yeah, so the process is that our next meeting we'll finalize those and
then we'll start the process of
actually start the process. Yeah.
Right. My hope is that for the committee meeting we will actually start the process with these 11. And then this subcommittee will continue to work on the next pass, which will be weighting.
Okay.
The criteria. So that ends up being our agenda. Wow, in the end we made more progress than I was expecting because we covered the ugly contentious items, and we've exited with usable criteria. Okay. And then
it also helps not as many people on the call.
Always make more progress that way.
Yeah,
do more work during the holiday week.
I think in the future, I ought to schedule these for holidays, right? The next call should be maybe get put in January.
Christmas Day.
Valentine's Day. We'll do Valentine's
midnight.
2 o'clock in the morning.
Okay. Okay, I do got to drop, guys. I think this is good. Thank you, Rob.
Happy New Year. Thank you all.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Gonna end it.